My father died when I was an infant, and I have little or no remembrance of him. My mother was a fashion designer, pretty well known at the time, had her own line of clothes, and used to go to Paris to get the latest styles every year, and but was very busy. I was in boarding school in the Stelton School in New Jersey, in a semi-rural area, and boarding school was a very pleasant place to be. It was a very super modern school. No marks for students or no classes, so we had a lot of fun playing most of the time. I would say from the age of 3 or 4 till 7 or 8, after which I left there and went to live with my grandmother in Woodstock, New York. And in those days, Woodstock was just a small rural community. My grandmother was very kind and good to me, and we lived there and we had a good time in Woodstock. And I lived there, and that's when I started my education, my formal education, because I couldn't read or write by the time I was 7 or 8. And so I went to a one-room schoolhouse in Woodstock, New York, and picked up reading and writing, particularly language, from Miss Toms, who was a wonderful teacher there. And the school was a one room with 3 different grades, which I went back to visit later on, and it was just about the size of this room, this one living room we're sitting in. I started my education in Manhattan probably about the 6th grade, I would guess, in a public school near Columbia University, and that was getting adjusted to a more rigorous routine. And of course, when you go as a boy to a new school, you have to fight your way to gain access, and so I did a little fighting to get integrated into this public school, after which I guess it was my mother's idea that I go to Lincoln Horace Mann School. I was at the Lincoln School for 3 or 4 years and left there to go to George Washington High School in the north part of Manhattan, up near the Cloisters. And the reason for doing that was the kids in the Lincoln School were pretty well-to-do. There were Rockefeller children there and others. And at age 16 or 17, I could not compete with guys who had their own apartments and endless money. So I decided that wasn't the place for me, and I went to George Washington High School. George Washington High School was very academic. It was a big school, about 6,000 students, and it was very rigorous and bureaucratic, and 3 or 4 hours homework every night. That's when I learned to study. College was easy after George Washington High School. There was no sports that I was involved in. Came home about 3 o'clock, and the rest of the evening was spent studying and getting prepared for the next day. The fun time was summertime. Well, summertime was never spent in Manhattan, but I always went away to summer camps in North Carolina or Maine. And one of the camps that was a lot of fun was Camp Millbrook in Maine, where we were on Highland Lake, and we had water sports, horses, and that was the fun. There was no studying or anything like that in the summertime. So the summertime was fun. The rest of the year, other than maybe going on a cruise in the wintertime, was studying. At this time also, like many New Yorkers, my mother decided she wanted to move out of Manhattan and go to the country where life would be easier. And so we moved to Connecticut, Deep River, Connecticut actually. And my mother bought a house there, and so we moved in 1942. Before I went in the Army, I had a year to spend in Deep River, Connecticut, and that was a pretty interesting year because my mother believed that, in me working or doing something rather than just sitting around. But since I didn't know when I was going to enter the military, I took a factory job. I remember starting at 50 cents an hour in one factory and then being thrilled to move to another, a safer factory, and a salary of 75 cents an hour. But there wasn't a lot of money involved, and I didn't have, if you're working 10 hours a day, you don't have that much time to spend money. And that wasn't thinking much about that. I was thinking more about the war, which I wanted to get into, wanted to get overseas and fight the Germans. So I was drafted in the spring of 1943, and my mother didn't seem too concerned about that, but I went to an induction center in Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and from there to infantry training in Florida, Camp Landing, Florida. The infantry basic was fine because I learned basic weapons, and I was an expert marksman, a so-called sniper at that time. And but then I got pulled out of that to go to the ASTP, it was called, program to train men to be officers and in engineering. And so I got sent to the University of Florida and wound up in taking courses in the Army. And so I actually got a whole semester's credit in under this program. I got tired of sitting all 6 days a week in classes at the University of Florida while the war was going on. So I volunteered to leave that and go overseas and requested combat duty in the infantry. And so I was sent to another unit, which happened to be the Signal Corps, not the infantry. I finally got assigned to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, to the Signal Corps, and they gave me a choice of anything I wanted to do in the Signal Corps. And since I wanted to get into some activity, the most active thing they had was to be an automotive mechanic or driver, because that way I would get around up toward where the action was overseas. So I wound up being an automotive mechanic in the Signal Corps. And an unfortunate affair was the 262nd Infantry that I was in went overseas, and they got torpedoed going across the English Channel. So the company that I had been trained in was almost all of them perished in the English Channel. And that wasn't known at the time, of course, during the war, but I found out about it later when the parents from the F Company wrote to me, wanted to know about their sons, what had happened. And of course, since I hadn't been on that ship, I didn't know what had happened to them. Landed in France, and then drove a convoy all the way down to Marseille, where was the invasion from the south was coming up. And so this Signal Service Battalion was stationed in Marseille, France. The war ended in Europe, and when I was in Marseille, but the war was still going on in Japan. So that was a chance for the powers that be. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, we'll ship you out to Japan. So that was the concern. um, of, of not going out to the Orient. By that time, most of the soldiers were anxious to come back home. So the next thing was to go to college, which fortunately there was a GI Bill which made all of this possible. So then I went to what today is Central Connecticut State College, and I was there for 3 years, and that was a very good education that I received there. And then went on to George Peabody College for Teachers in Nashville, Tennessee for a year. And then after that I taught high school history in Jackson, Mississippi. I got a nice job there in Central High School. That was probably the largest high school in Mississippi, because Jackson, of course, is the capital. And those 3 years there were very pleasant. When I say I had the best students I ever had in Central High School by far, people in the North hardly find that hard to believe, but I'll tell you this. I had all these wonderful students in Central High School, and when I was going to Vanderbilt, I knew I was going to Vanderbilt. I said, it was a big school, so we had 4 college counselors full-time, and one, Pauline Carter, was very good. And I said to Pauline, I have all these wonderful students, why don't you send some of them up to Vanderbilt? And I didn't think much more about it. But then when I got up to Vanderbilt, after I left, so 4 years later from leaving Central High School, someone sent me a plaque, or a notice of a plaque, that Central High School had been awarded, received an award for sending the best prepared students in the United States to Vanderbilt. So these kids were good. So while my training was in education, I decided to go forward into graduate school and a PhD program at Vanderbilt University. I was being trained as a criminologist, which is to investigate not so much crime as such, as to investigate criminals, who they are and what they do, and the kinds of crimes they commit and the reason for it. And I found that very exciting and challenging. At the beginning, more challenging as to answering the question of why people commit crime. And you wind up, of course, finding out that crime is, for many, is a way of life. Marion's father was a professor at the University of Kentucky, and I was. So we met through one of his experiments. He was in sports medicine, and that way I met Marion, and it was pretty much love at first sight. It didn't take long before we got married. We married in Lexington, Kentucky at the faculty club, and it was beautiful. And because we had all the faculty members there, and it was very pleasant and a nice day. And then we went on a month's vacation, a honeymoon, and traveled over a good part of the country. So Charles was born in '62 and Elizabeth in 1963. We just looked in the dictionary, and Charles and Elizabeth seemed like good names from the dictionary. Charles and Elizabeth were very good children, and they were in nice schools, and they had a successful education, and the whole family, I think, was very fortunate that everything progressed satisfactorily. And at this time, in the early 60s, the United States was undergoing a change in terms of drug use. Epidemics were hitting. So the federal government decided to establish research into the social aspects or the epidemiological aspects of drug abuse. And they added to the Addiction Research Center in Lexington a whole section on social science. So we were the social science section, which was just established. And Jack O'Donnell and I established this at the narcotics hospital. And this was very exciting because we were able to develop a whole research program within what was then Public Health Service and subsequently became the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So I was able, for example, to build a database on all of the patients who had ever been in the Lexington Hospital, which had opened in 1935, and there was another hospital in Fort Worth. So I built the database. It took about 3 or 4 years to computerize records, approaching 100,000 records from these 2 hospitals. So for the first time we had all kinds of complicated and authoritative information about drug abusers in the United States. It was time to move on from Lexington because I had a position which was as high as the director of the hospital, and in order to advance I had to go elsewhere. So that was when I decided to move to Philadelphia. So I joined the psychiatric department at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And my job in the department was to teach residents and others about drug abuse and its treatment. Marion also came to the medical school in Philadelphia, and Marion then got her advanced degree from Temple. But we lived on the main line in Wynwood, Philadelphia, and we had a nice big house. Charles went to Haverford School and Elizabeth went to Baldwin School in just outside of Philadelphia. So when we came to Baltimore, I had a multi-million-dollar grant, moved about 10 people here to Baltimore. So we rented in Charlesbrook for a year while we were looking for a house, and they were building this house, and so I happened to go by on the street and see this building going up, and came in, and that's how we got to this location. So during this period in Lexington, and especially here in Baltimore, I did a lot of work internationally in Europe and Asia, Africa, all over the world. So a big part of my whole life has been actual contact with criminals and drug abusers, usually the tougher types. And so I like to say I've interviewed probably more tough criminals than anybody, most people have ever met. And this is true, the slums of Harlem, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, the slums in South Africa, the opium dens in China, and the tough prisons in Singapore, and the prisons in England and Germany, and so on. The most rewarding by far was, other than the family, which for always was very important for both Marion and me, raising a family and seeing that they're looked after and headed in the right direction. But other than that, in my case, in terms of career, it was the research, because it's very rewarding, and one likes to think it's important to find out how people actually start shooting heroin, or is there any reason why they get off of drugs, and what kind of crimes do they commit. If you're going to be a good researcher, you have to have an enterprising mind and a willingness to look at different outcomes. The teaching is like high school. After you've taught high school for 3 or 4 years, you've kind of maximized what you're going to learn. And then that was my feeling. And then the same with teaching on a college level. If you've taught introductory sociology, or even graduate students, PhD candidates, or even medical students, after you've done that for several years, it's time to do something else if you're anxious to advance knowledge. Looking back over everything, what is not recognized by very few is there are major, it's not all peaches and cream. There, on all these projects, it is very difficult, and there are obstacles and people who tried to stop you and prevent you from completing your project. So it's not in this interview, and it's not in the literature. And let me give you an example. When you pick up a book, the acknowledgments say all the people who have helped make this book or this project successful. It seldom, if ever, mentions all the people who tried to stop it or avoid it or destroy it. But just as many people are trying to prevent it oftentimes as to help you. So when I went into the slums of Manhattan doing research, and I recall giving a lecture to a group of treatment people in Harlem. They asked me, what do I do to get the research done? And I told them I do everything short of homicide to get the project done. I don't think they understood what I was saying, but it's true. So I did, in order to do all the research that I've done, do almost everything except homicide.